Can we start? Excellent. Thank you everybody for coming for this week's seminar series at the Department of Marine Geosciences. Today we are hosting Dr. Lior Rubanenko from the Technion in the same city we are sitting. Thank you, Lior, for coming. A short bio of Lior. Dr. Rubanenko's work focuses on understanding the physical mechanism that drives surface processes on Earth and the terrestrial planets. His main research focuses on sediment transport on Mars and the accumulation and erosion of volatile substances on the Moon. He has a bachelor from Tel Aviv University, a master on Weizmann Institute of Sciences, and a PhD from University of California in LA. And then later he continued for a postdoc at Stanford, that he finished in 2023. Presently, he is an assistant professor at the Division of Geoinformation Engineering at the Technion. So today, we are very honored to host you here. And his talk is about water flow on an ancient Mars and the distribution of water across the inner solar system. So Lior, thank you very much, and the podium is yours.
So thank you so much for inviting me today. As you mentioned, my talk is going to be focused around water flow on ancient Mars, and I'm going to try to put it in context of generally the distribution of water across the inner solar system. What you see here on the bottom are kind of examples, segments of 3 different planets that I'll be talking about today. I'm going to be, again, the main focus of the talk is going to be Mars, but on the left you see the Moon, and on the right you see Mercury, which kind of looks similar to some people, depending on the illumination direction, the illumination angle. And on the center, here in the center, you see the North Pole of Mars, which has this characteristic heart shape, almost, right? So those 3 bodies all have water on them for different reasons, and I think there's a lot to be learned from the distribution of water on all those bodies, on how water accumulated, and eroded through time in the solar system. And just because my lab is relatively new, it's about 1 year old at the Technion, I'm going to briefly tell you about what I do. So I'm a planetary scientist. I study surface processes on planets in the solar system. Some planetary scientists have started venturing into exoplanets, so planetary surface processes on other planets. This is relatively, or very new, actually, field of research. And here's an example of one of the studies that I conducted on Mars. More or less, I think it was 2019 and 2018 when machine learning started taking our world by storm, right? It looked like the methods we've been using to analyze images from spacecraft, from satellites, it made them seem outdated almost, right? And in 2019, I started asking myself, why not use those new techniques, those machine learning techniques, to try and see if we can automatically analyze images, spacecraft images, satellite images on planets on Earth. And what you see here, for example, is an example study I conducted on Mars, where I globally outlined Barkan dunes. Those are those crescentic, moon-like dunes that you see here on the left. And what's nice about Barkan dunes is that they're very informative. They tell us a lot about the environment in which they form and evolve. And you can deduce what are the conditions that form those dunes. For example, where the wind blows, right? What's the direction of the wind, or the main direction of the wind, just from the images, just by analyzing the morphology of dunes, and compile, for example, a map of something that looks like the global circulation of Mars, just from the shapes of dunes across the surface of Mars. Mars is a big desert. You can see something that looks like the global circulation here on top, and here near the pole at the bottom. This is kind of an example of what my lab is focused on. But before I start, I want to tell you kind of a neat story about this time we decided to attack the Moon and how it's all related to the presence of water ice. So the Moon is a unique body. I'm going to talk about the thermal environment of the Moon in a few more slides, in a couple more slides. But What you see here on the left is an artist illustration. Of course, that's not an image of a spacecraft, a real spacecraft called the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter. It's a spacecraft that actually took the Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter, which is a spacecraft mission I'm involved with, that's orbiting the moon as we speak. And the spacecraft fired a center missile. This is this white canister, white cylinder that you see here. The same missile can actually carry warheads. This one was without warhead. And the spacecraft just fired this missile onto the south pole of the moon, specifically into a crater, into an impact crater, a big hole in the ground that formed because of a much larger impact. And what you see here on the left and on the right are two kind of frames two frames in the same sequence. This is 2 hours before the impact. T is the impact. So 2 hours before the impact, this is the left column, and 90 seconds after the impact is the right column. And this blue area here is the temperature, or all of this is the temperature of the crater. Red is hot, blue is cold. Temperatures themselves don't really matter. But what you see here is that the area inside the crater, just here, just this little blip basically, became very hot very rapidly. And the impact of this missile onto this crater called Cabeos released a plume of material, of dust, of ice, and different types of ices that was later observed from Earth and from a shepherding spacecraft and analyzed spectroscopically to understand what's going on exactly in this plume of ice. And this plume kind of put the final nail in the coffin, showing that the moon has a significant amount of ice trapped inside polar craters. So that's one example. And of course, on Earth, we know there's water. All you need to do is go to, look out the window at the Mediterranean. So there's a lot of water on Earth, much more than, at least on the surface, than other planets in the inner solar system. And what's very interesting is Mars specifically, because on Mars, we have a lot of evidence for significant quantities of water. What you see here is not a picture from Earth. This is something you may find in the, maybe around the corner, right, in the Nile Delta. This is a delta fan, something you see a lot on Earth. You see an inlet channel here on the left, and this inlet channel carried water and sediment into a lake. What you see here is the wall of a lake. It's also an impact crater. Used to be or is still an impact crater. And the water deposited sediment in the form of a delta fan. And understanding the evolution of this delta fan can tell us a lot about how surface water evolved on Mars. So, it kind of begs the question, how come? Why is there water on all the planets in the solar system? And the story kind of begins with the protoplanetary disk, the way the solar system formed. So every solar system that we know of forms because of the collapse of a star. And around the star, the residual material, starts accreting into what's called protoplanets. And the way we understand how the inner solar system formed is by those specks of dust, those things you find under your bed, are very similar to probably what we had in the primordial solar system. My mom used to call those luflufim. And we take all those luflufim, as you know, are very sticky, right? When you blow, or when you kind of broom them or move them, push them together, they kind of coalesce, right? They become bigger and bigger, basically. And this is more or less, we think, those are, of course, electrostatic forces. And this is what we think started the accretion of planets. And the accretion grew faster and faster. In this process we call oligarchic growth, where the bigger planets that have a stronger gravitational pull accreted faster than those smaller bodies. They basically pulled those smaller bodies in, eventually forming, through collisions, what we call protoplanets. So planets more or less the size of Mars, which is more or less half the size of Earth, they kind of roamed around in this primordial solar system. And of course, you can understand that closer to the sun, this arrow here indicates temperature, conceptually at least. Closer to the sun, the temperatures are much greater, much higher than further away from the sun, right? This makes sense because the sun is a big source of heat, this primordial sun. We can even define a line, which we call the frost line, beyond which water can no longer, beyond which water is stable even though it's in vacuum. So if we have a piece of ice and it gets too hot because we're in vacuum, because we're in space, the ice would just go away, right? However, beyond this line, the temperature is just not high enough to sublimate the ice within a short, what we call a short period of time, the lifetime of the solar system or of planets or something. So ice can easily accrete beyond the frost line and not easily accrete on the other side of the, closer to the sun. So the Earth, of course, is much closer to the sun than the frost line. So how did water even came to be or came to accrete on those inner solar system bodies? And one of the stories that we like to tell, which is still debated among the community, is that fragments of ice and debris, ice-rich debris, you can call it, from the outer solar system migrated inwards and collided with those planetary bodies, Earth and the other planetary bodies, slowly accreting water onto them. However, of course, impacts can not just deposit volatiles, right? Not cause the accretion of volatiles, but can also erode them. This is a very famous animation by a scientist called Robin Canup, who is one of the, I would say, most famous planetary scientists living today. And she, in 2005, compiled those very complex computational simulations that were only made possible by those recent technological advancements that we see in the past decades. And what is simulated here is a giant impact between two of those planetary bodies, those two planetesimals that I talked about, one the size of Earth and one the size of Mars. And this was one of the explanations, or the leading explanation, I'd say, for the formation of the moon, for example. So we see that some of those impacts, the smaller impacts, may have accumulated, may have deposited volatiles. But the larger impacts, of course, eroded volatiles. They can erode the atmosphere. They can heat up the surface, as you can see here. They send shockwaves all the way through the two bodies, the bigger planet, of course, the smaller planet. So impacts are not necessarily a net deposition process. And one of the questions that interest me, and I think a lot of other people, is what can we learn from the present distribution of water, surface and near surface water in the inner solar system, but the origins of water in the inner solar system? Where did water come from? What does that mean about habitability, especially on Mars? We're interested now in another a moon of Jupiter, much further away than Mars, called Europa. You might have heard about it as well. So there's likely water and under a subsurface ocean on Europa. And the link between water and habitability is something very it's very interesting to me, and I think to other scientists again, and because it might help us explain how we, as a human species, right, how we got to be here. And of course, and this is kind of the final bullet point here, can we sustain long-term missions in space? This is something that's also very interesting to us. Can we build what we call the research station, a city, quote unquote, on the moon and on Mars? It's something that looks like science fiction. However, it's being talked about as we speak on Mars. In NASA, there's a program called the Moon to Mars program, which NASA talks about. The Lunar Gateway is another program that NASA talks about. And the idea is to build a permanent research station on the moon to kind of help us get to other planets in the solar system more easily. This is something that should happen in the next decade or so. And my answer is that we can learn a lot about all those questions through the study of surface processes, through geomorphology. And I promised to talk about a few planets today. I'm going to briefly mention the Moon and Mercury, which are here. This is the Sun. This one is Venus here, but mostly focus on Mars. So what's interesting about the Moon and Mercury is that the planets are airless and host a very interesting, a very, I would say, unique thermal environment. And this thermal environment, as you can imagine, when I have a slide here, and if you can imagine the moon going around the Earth, it has an axis of rotation that's almost perpendicular to what we call the ecliptic plane, which is the plane in which Earth orbits the sun. And that means I'm gonna try to explain that using my hands. I think it's a good way of explaining that. If that's the moon's axis of rotation, I hope you can see me, and that's the sun, it appears as if the moon is going around the sun with its axis of rotation always perpendicular to its orbit around the sun. So that means that the poles of the moon almost never see daylight, right? Earth is tilted. So as it goes around the sun, sometimes its north pole is exposed to the sun, sometimes its south pole is exposed to the sun, depending on the season. However, the moon, the poles of the moon, almost never get exposed to the sun, especially inside impact craters, especially inside cavities. And that's interesting because Mercury has the same configuration, by the way. There are many reasons for that, which we're not going to go into now. But that means that those craters here, those are craters near the south pole of the sun, of the moon, excuse me. And as the sun goes around or the moon goes around the sun, but in this frame of reference, the sun goes around the moon, you can see that those craters cast very persistent shadows that never go away. And we have models and observations that show that some of those shadows have been there for geologic timescales, for billions of years. And that's interesting, right? Because if you put a little bit of ice inside those, what we call permanent shadows, the ice has no reason to go anywhere. It's essentially as cold as space. It's an airless environment. The obliquity is small, as I said, so those cavities cast shadows. So cold, there's no reason for the ice to go anywhere. It's actually one of the coldest places in the solar system, just right here around the corner. And as I mentioned, if we put a little ice inside those cavities, inside those craters, this ice has no reason to go away. And one of the easiest calculations you can make or you can do to kind of answer the question of how did ice even get to those cavities, to those craters, is, let's say a big comet impacts the moon and releases volatile molecules across the surface. What you see here on the left is a Monte Carlo simulation of those volatile molecules, those black dots. And you know that there are two main forces, right, controlling the movement of those molecules in an exosphere. The moon has an exosphere. It's airless. It's not like Earth. There's no collisional atmosphere. So the main two forces are gravity, which is holding the molecule close to the surface, and it's thermal energy, or it's thermal energy that drives it away from the surface. It basically makes it hop on the surface in those ballistic hops. And by equating those two energies, the gravitational energy, this is like a physics 101 kind of exercise, you can get that the hop length, by kind of plugging in parameters here. So K is the Boltzmann constant, T is the temperature of the surface, M is the molecular mass, and G is the gravity of the moon. And if you plug in numbers here, for about 300 Kelvin, which is the temperature more or less at the equator of the moon, you get about 100 kilometer hop length. So those molecules, as they reach the surface, doesn't really matter how, impacts or whatever, they hop on the surface in those really huge hops of hundreds of kilometers. The moon's radius is about 1,700 kilometers, so it doesn't take more than a few dozens of hops to get to the pole and stay there. And we have a lot of evidence that water has been accumulating on Mercury. This is an example for Mercury. We see evidence in radar reflectance, in microwave reflectance. These are model temperatures. And you see that whenever the temperature is cold enough, right, the pink and blue is cold enough, there's also ice accumulated by, for example, looking at radar reflectance and microwave reflectance. On the moon, the picture is slightly more complicated because we don't see a lot of ice where it's supposed to be. We're supposed to see it, which is a topic for a different talk. However, we do see elevated brightness, elevated microwave albedo, so microwave reflectance, exactly where ice is supposed to be. So that's also encouraging. And we have other evidence in neutron spectroscopy and others to tell us there's a lot of water, maybe not as much as on Mercury, but there's a lot of water on the moon as well. And the takeaway point from all this introduction is that there's very old and potentially billion-year-old ice on Mercury and the moon, very close, right around the corner. And that impacts are a main source, maybe not the only source, but are a main source of this ice. And that's interesting because this is kind of the beginning of the story, right? It tells us the water has been accumulating on the planets, on planetary bodies, throughout the past billions of years. But what's going on today? What's causing the discrepancy? Why there's so much water on Earth, but there's no water at all on all the other planets, liquid water at least. We can talk about ice in a second on all these other planetary bodies. And the story I want to tell you starts actually in more or less the 18th century. This guy, I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Schiaparelli. So our friend Giovanni Schiaparelli used this 49 centimeter Merton Respel telescope again, I said in the 18th century, to look at Mars. And this is more or less a picture of Mars as how it looks in the sky to you if you look at it without a telescope. And what he saw was more or less that. Probably. Maybe this is even better than what he saw. So imagine, staring at this circle, essentially, this disk for hours and hours. And what he thought he saw, what he sketched, because there were no photographs back then. So what he sketched was that. He sketched what he called canali. And what he believed were big channels of water, potentially irrigation. They imagined, life on Mars and all those things, because he saw those canali changing places, basically evolving through time. And this is one of the famous sketches that he made of all the canali on Mars. Some of those features we recognize today. Hellas is a big impact crater, a big impact basin on Mars. Argyre is another impact basin on Mars. Tharsis is something that's stuck to this day. But all those canalis were later discovered to be, even though they were mapped by other astronomers as well. This is another famous astronomer, Parzival Lowell, that mapped the canali on Mars. But they were discovered to be basically nothing. And I think a funny, this is just it's very unrelated, but or a little unrelated, but a funny or an interesting experiment that was conducted maybe 100 years ago, 120 years ago, by two astronomers. What they did was they gave students in a classroom a picture of a disk, something that looks more or less like what Schiaparelli and others and Parzival Lowell looked like through telescopes, and asked them to draw what they saw sitting at different distances from the disk. And you see that essentially each student drew something else, drew a different pattern, even though the pattern they were looking at is the same pattern. And what's very interesting is that those canali that Schiaparelli discovered were later discovered when we sent spacecraft to Mars. For example, the Viking orbiter, were discovered to be nothing. However, what Viking did see on the surface are much smaller canals, right? Look at the scale here. That's a 10 kilometer. Bar here is about 10 kilometers. What Viking, the orbiter, the spacecraft, did see on the surface is a lot of evidence for, or many lines of evidence for channels and surface runoff, something that we see in the desert, in Israel and other places as well. So even though Schiaparelli and Lowell and all those other people were wrong about the presence of large-scale irrigation canals or big canals, we know today that Mars used to hold a lot of surface water that went away. And some even hypothesize that some of this water once accumulated into a big ocean in the northern hemisphere of Mars. So what you see here are two examples two images that led to this hypothesis. You see boulders that are oriented in a specific direction and channels that are created when tsunami waves, supposedly tsunami waves, came from this ocean and swept water away back into the ocean. And the fact that those channels are perpendicular to those shorelines, this claim has been since disputed, or still, I would say, actively discussed. But there are some evidence, I would say, for the presence, or even for the presence of an ocean near the North Pole of Mars. This is one of the papers that attempted to map those shorelines. This is the So maybe I should briefly mention what we're seeing here. So that's the polar cap that I showed you in one of the first pictures. This, of course, a picture of how Mars would have looked like with a big ocean. There's a big cavity in the North Pole of Mars that was likely caused by an impact, and some hypothesize that this cavity was filled with water, same as an ocean on Earth. And the immediate questions is, of course, no canali on Mars, but we have a lot of different, or I would say many separate lines of evidence that tell us that liquid water existed on Mars. However, why did this water went away? Were conditions were ever conducive to habitability? Can life ever exist on Mars? And what's going on today? We know there's no liquid water on Mars. It's a very difficult question to answer if there's at all no liquid water on Mars. But what is the prevalence of water on Mars today? It's a good question. And I think one of the best places to answer these questions is this site. So one of the first images I showed you in this talk is that of Jezero crater, right? I showed you a picture of a delta, which we're going to focus on in a second. And this is the area around the delta. You can kind of see the delta here. And that's the lake I was mentioning. And this later crater lake called Jezero is the main objective of a rover mission called the Mars 2020, or the Perseverance rover, which you might have heard about in the news, that landed more or less here in the center of the crater and made its way all the way to the delta. Now it's more or less here between the delta and the wall of the crater. And this entire region called the Nile Fossé region shows significant erosion and surface runoff, or evidence for erosion and surface runoff of water that was drained from this entire region onto the crater. And the presence of the delta here, that's kind of, I'm zooming in on this area here, sorry, I'm zooming in on this red square. The presence of this delta and this inlet channel shows us that the flow of water was significant. Again, its duration is unclear, something we can try to constrain, or we're going to try to constrain today. But at least the amount of water that flowed in those inlet channels was likely significant, because there's a lot of sediment here, and accumulating the sediment takes a long time. And this is kind of an artist illustration that shows how Jezero might have looked like in the past, when it was filled with water, allegedly again, and today. So how do you go about constraining the amount of water in Jezero? And one way to do it is by looking at boulders. So boulders are a good indication, or I'd say the morphology of boulders and the distribution of boulders can be a good indication of the surface processes that went through a region of interest. And I would say you can divide the types of boulders we see on Earth and on Mars into kind of three groups, right? Boulders can accumulate through landslides, like you see here on the left. This boulder, for example, is as big as a car behind it, right? So those pretty big boulders form because erosion collapses cliffs and the like. And another potential source for the accumulation or the disposition of boulders is glacial erratics. This happens when glaciers thaw, or as they thaw, they move boulders, or boulders kind of move on the glacier itself, and they're deposited more or less uniformly where the glacier was. And of course, we have debris flows. And again, those are pretty big boulders. This is from Switzerland. You can see those pretty big boulders being swept away by it's not really water. It's water mixed with a lot of sediment. That's why it has so much force. It's driving boulders downstream, causing the accumulation of boulders near the end in the downflow direction of the debris flow. And what's interesting is that we can use the very distinct morphologies and distributions of each one of those processes to kind of learn about the process themselves, the process that deposited boulders, right? So with landslides, we see boulders that are similar to the bedrock, right? Because they were brought from the top of the cliff of the bedrock onto the bottom. They're likely grouped and close to the base of the cliff. In glacial erratics, the boulders are isolated, but they're spread around. They cover a wide area. They're not very much located in the same place. And with the brief flow, we expect to see weak sorting because the brief flows are so powerful that they kind of drive boulders, causing or not making larger boulders or not depositing larger sediment grains closer to the closer upstream rather than downstream. And of course, we can look at the mass of boulders and use the mass of boulders to estimate the discharge and potentially the density of the sediment that carried those boulders. And what we did here was use a machine learning technique. Again, this is similar to what I've shown you before, to map all the boulders across the Jezero delta. So what you see here are examples of how the machine learning algorithm performed, and it found relatively large boulders. So a 7-meter boulder is, is almost the size of as big as a small house, right? So those are pretty big boulders scattered around the delta. And how are they distributed? What can we learn from the distribution about the source of those boulders? Well, what we see is what you see here are basically boulder distribution counts per square kilometers, per kilometer squared. And those lines are channels mapped by other people, manually mapped by other people. And you can see that the distribution of boulders are mainly distributed along those channel lines, right? Those previously channeled lines in almost something that looks like fingers stretching from the palm, right? And so that's the distribution of boulders, which is interesting. They're scattered, they're distributed along those channels. But also, we see very weak sorting, which, as we said before, can tell us something about the process that brought those boulders to the surface. So we see it doesn't look like there are bigger boulders downstream rather than upstream. And that the distribution of boulders is very different. The distribution of boulders we see, for example, near the edge of the wall of the crater, so near the cliff, where the size distribution is clearly similar to the size distribution you would get from when boulders are driven by erosion, or the formation or the accumulation of boulders is driven by erosion. So it doesn't look like erosion, it looks more like something else. And out of the three explanations, or the three potential mechanisms I talked about before, it looks like boulders on the delta were driven there through debris flow, through very strong discharge of sediment and water that came through those channels, which I guess it's a pretty logical explanation. And by looking at experiments on Earth and observation on Earth, we can estimate that the discharge is actually very similar to discharges we see here on Earth. So again, this bolsters this idea that water, the flow of water, was a very important erosional process on early Mars. Of course, now there's no water, but on early Mars. So that's locally in Jezero. Another thing we can do, we can also look at other surface features, for example, craters, to kind of understand what is distribution of water today. Of course, liquid water is almost or likely doesn't exist on Mars today. There are maybe a few local examples. However, there's likely ice in the subsurface. And geomorphology can also help us understand how this, or what's the prevalence and what's the distribution of this ice. So what you see here are the two top panels are the depth to diameter, the ratio between the depth and the diameter of craters. So it's basically, it's a way to normalize the depth of the crater relative to its diameter. Across the two poles of Mars, and the southernmost circle here you see is latitude 60. This is the northern hemisphere, and this is southern hemisphere. And you see that there is a sharp drop, and this is another kind of transect, you can say, of the depth to diameter of craters across the globe of Mars. And you can see that around 45 degrees in latitude, more or less, in both hemispheres, there's a sharp drop in the depth of diameter. So craters become significantly shallower, right? If you take a crater, it just becomes significantly shallower around 45 degrees, which is exactly the latitude where ice should start accumulating. So it looks like that not only there are examples or I would say an answer to the question of where those water that we see in Jezero and other places on Mars went, one of the answers could be in the subsurface. And the geomorphology of features or the morphology of features can help us constrain this water. Another way to look at water, and I think I don't have a lot of time, right? How long have I had?
Yeah, we should start wrapping up.
Wrapping up, okay, yeah. So I'm going to very briefly mention this very recent project. We can also look at dunes to tell us about seasonality and ice accumulation on Mars. You see frosty dunes near the North Pole of Mars. And the way they change throughout the years can tell us something about the accumulation of ice and the erosion of ice on their slip faces. I'm going to skip a few slides here. Just tell you that what we're doing right now is looking at the transects of the topography of those dunes. And this is a classic dune, right? It has a slip face and a stas, shallower stas. And what's interesting is that we see the dunes in low latitudes have more or less the same or the expected slip face slope angle, which is governed by the angle of repose because sediment collapses on the slip face size, collapses to the angle of repose. However, near the pole, we see a diminished slip face angle, which might be a result of those seasonal processes. And the most, I think, interesting and curious feature here, which I'm just going to briefly mention, I'm not going to talk a lot about, is what we see is another dip in high mid latitudes. And I'm not going to leave you questioning what's going on here. I'm going to tell you immediately that this dip coincides with seasonality. Essentially, we see that the shallowest slip faces on Mars, relative to the angle of repose, are where the peak seasons occur on Mars, when the difference between winter and summer is greatest on the surface. This is shown here by the dashed line, shows the temperature stand, the annual temperature stand deviation. Again, I don't have, unfortunately, time to really go into that. But this likely is the process we're seeing. Those are volatiles, allegedly, driving down sediment or eroding the sediment on the slip face size, on the slip face side of dunes. And really, just to briefly summarize, we see the geomorphology and geomorphic features can help us constrain the abundance of volatiles on the moon and on Mars. We can look at surface albedo, etc., and the morphology of the topography of the craters themselves. We saw examples on both Mars and the moon. And we can understand from boulders and dunes what was the past water discharge and what is the prevalence of modern ice these days. And I think a way to kind of understand or a good takeaway point from what I've talked about today is that even though a lot of people think that there was a prolonged period of water flow on the surface of Mars and potentially an ocean, all those things, I think very recent evidence shows us this might not have been the case. And the formation of the delta on Jezero and the formation of all the channels, of all the examples of the channels I've shown you, was likely caused by transient water flow. So basically floods, a series of floods that formed because of potentially localized heating events by impacts or volcanic eruptions that temporarily heated the planet, thawing the ice, causing those floods and the accumulation of sediment in those places. And by looking at how those processes are distributed across the surface of Mars, there are other examples of deltas on Mars. We can learn more about the processes that accumulated, accreted water on its surfaces and of course, eroded it eventually. And at this point, I want to thank you and ask if you have any questions for me. I know this has been it's been quite dense, so please ask away.
Thank you. Do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Yeah, okay. So thank you. Amazing talk. I have a lot of questions, but I will see if the students here have a question. Yeah, okay. One moment. אתה שומע את הסטודנטית?
בקושי.
Say it louder.
Okay, according to the conclusion, you mentioned that the water is basically from flash floods. Can you hear me?
She's asking.
Yeah, so if water is what? Sorry, I couldn't hear the last word.
Flood. So basically.
Flash floods, yes,
flash
yes,
floods.
exactly, yeah. Especially in Jezero, yeah.
Yeah, do you know if the water is drinkable?
Okay, is this water drinkable?
So again, there's no water today on Mars. We're looking at very ancient processes. Those processes occurred probably billions of years ago, maybe 3 billion years ago. Today, there's no liquid water on Mars. But we can ask the question if those water were drinkable 3 billion years ago. And the answer is likely no. And the reason is that to move those big boulders, we mentioned that to move those big boulders, you don't need only a very strong flow, a very fast flow, right? A very fast flash flood, but also likely a high sediment content. So it's sediment mixed with water. And it's likely that the density, right, the ratio between the fluid density and the rock density, which appears here, is the main contributor in the ability of the flow to carry boulders. And it's likely that this ratio was relatively high. So there was a lot of sediment in the fluid, which means we're looking at a mixture of sediment and water, not pure water. So I wouldn't drink it. But it's an interesting question. Thanks.
Okay, another question from Orly. Orly?
Hi. First of all, thank you very much. It was a really fascinating talk. I just want to say that I didn't miss it. Just say that the process was that in the beginning was only ice, then it was some major heating event.
On Mars, you're asking?
Yeah.
Specifically on Mars, yeah.
Yeah, it was only Mars, then it was the major heating event, and then there was another heating event that made all the water disappear. That's the process. So
the idea is that water accretes mainly as ice on those bodies, and of course haven't had time to touch on all those topics. But Mars is too far away from the sun, especially the sun as it was 4 billion years ago. The sun was much fainter then, so the temperatures were much lower, and ice was much better preserved on the surface of Mars. The question how ice was distributed on the surface of Mars is still an open question. But what I meant to say is that we know there was a lot of ice on Mars on the surface. We see ice today on the surface of Mars. And localized heating events like impacts, like major impacts and like volcanic eruptions could have thawed this ice, could have melted this ice essentially, driving those flash floods. So I'm not saying, potentially the first accretional processes were also impact related, potentially. There could be other processes, of course, volcanic eruptions, etc. However, later impacts and later volcanic eruptions had a net erosive effect or a net anti-depositional. It's not really erosive, right? Because you're just changing the state of the ice, but had a net anti-depositional effect, causing the ice to melt in the form of liquid water. So what we think might have happened is that a big impact basically removed a lot of dust from the surface and mixed it with the atmosphere, creating a much denser atmosphere than what we see today on Mars. Today on Mars, the atmosphere is about 1,000th of that on Earth. But it could be that through heating and through the release of dust, the atmosphere we created basically a localized greenhouse effect, which basically preserved heat and allowed periods of extended liquid water flow on the surface. So we're talking about much later impacts than those impacts that brought the ice or brought the water into the surface. If that answers your question, I hope I was able to answer. Okay.
Any more questions?
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, please.
Karen.
Great lecture. Thank you. Do you know if the Perseverance is going to check chemical evidence for water where it's currently studying the area, or just geomorphology?
Yeah, that's a great question. So Perseverance is mostly interested actually in the geochemistry of the surface. Actually, I would say that's the main. Perseverance has a bunch of instruments. I would say the main two instruments are the ground penetrating radar, which is not a chemical instrument, and then a spectrometer, a state-of-the-art spectrometer. And what they're looking at are chemical alterations of clays, essentially, to see if there are clays in the surface, which they found plenty evidence of. But we know there have been clays on Mars for many years now. I think since MRO was launched, so about 20 years. We know from orbit, from satellite observations, that there are clays in the Jezero region. I want to carefully say that we haven't gained a lot from those very localized observations. So by sampling the surface locally, we haven't gained a lot yet, because we already knew there are clays there. So we knew there was liquid water there. And there's a plan that's, I think, the more interesting part. So what part of Perseverance's mission was to collect samples and place them in vials, basically metallic vials that just basically rest on the surface along the path. So Perseverance started somewhere here and kind of moved all the way to the top of the delta. So it left kind of souvenirs along its path. And there's a very expensive mission that's heavily disputed now within NASA to bring back those samples. And yeah, it's going to cost a lot of money. But the idea is to fish those samples out of the surface and bring them back to Earth, in which case we could use a much better spectrometer and much better techniques, right? Yeah, the geometric techniques to understand the origin of those rocks. But this is very far away in the future. We're talking about, 20, 30 years from now. Elon Musk says we can do it earlier, so maybe, but...
You already sent a car, so...
Exactly, you already sent the car
soon.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Sure.
More questions? Yeah, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for the lecture. I just have a question. You said there is a surface evidence of glacier or ice on the Mars. So if this is correct and is of present day, how is the climate actually impacting on it? Is it not causing it to melt? And if it's melting, why then are you saying there is presently no water?
So I think you're asking, and correct me if I'm wrong, you're asking, we see a lot of places where we think there's ice under the surface, and you're asking what happens when something impacts this ice? Is that the question?
Okay. If I got you well, that presently you can still find ice on the surface of Mars.
Yeah.
If that is correct, then I'm thinking with the climate and the global melting of this ice, there should be water. There should be present water.
So because of the low atmospheric density of Mars, again, it's much fainter than that of Earth. It's actually around 6 millipowers, which is exactly a triple point. So water can technically survive on the surface of Mars, liquid water, but probably not for long. And what likely happens when something impacts those ice-rich, this ice-rich regolith, the ice-rich subsurface of Mars, the ice likely just sublimates, goes into the atmosphere, and it doesn't melt as ice on Earth would melt if something would impact, for example, Antarctica or something like that. So, so we're looking at almost immediate sublimation of any deposits on the surface of Mars. And there are places where spacecraft exposed subsurface ice, kind of dug a few meters into the subsurface, exposed layers of ice, And we can see that the size goes away almost immediately because of the low atmospheric density of Mars.
I'm really sorry, but we need to end because there is
Yeah, okay, it's fine.
class. It was an amazing talk, and I have
Okay, I'm glad.
questions, and hopefully in the future I will get to ask them. So thank you very much. And
Thank you.
we will recommend people to hear to listen to look at the recorded talk. Thank you very much.
Thank you again. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
להתראות. תודה.
Thank you.
Bye.